I lost my colonel here just about a year ago. I'm the president of the 20th Armored Division. Work for the memorial in Washington, D.C. coming up in May. And that's been a chore.
Okay, everything's going.
Uh-oh.
Well, we have an honor this morning to interview Freddie Stueve, S-T-U-E-V-E. Freddie was born July 29th, 1924, and he's from Wamego, Kansas. He was born in White City, Kansas. I'm the interviewer, Oris Kelly, and our cameraman and producer is Ray Kurtz.
Mm-hmm.
And we're delighted, Fred, to have you here, and we'd like to have you start by giving us can you give us your name, rank, and serial number?
Okay. Army is Freddie C. Stueve, 375-27947. And my rank is T5, Technician 5th grade. MOS number 660, tank mechanics, tank operations, and anything to maintain and keep a tank, an M7, vehicles in operation.
Very good. Well, tell us a little bit about your background, where you were born, your family, and...
Well, I was born on Upper Clarks Creek near White City, Kansas. It's the farm is known today as the Stueve Bottoms, just short distance from Latimer, Kansas. I was born there, and at the age of about 3.5 years old, we moved to a farm east of Junction City, and lived there. My father worked for the Union Pacific Railroad, and from Junction City, from the Bob Hayes farm on east of Junction City on McDowell Creek, we moved to Junction City. We lived at 116 East Pine Street, Junction City, the south end of the city, and lived there, grew up in Junction City, went to school there, and then registered for the draft and was drafted out of high school. And I asked the principal, was there any that I could get a deferment until graduation? So he put into the draft board there in Junction City, and they deferred me from January to May. I got a diploma at May 21st, 1943, and the following Monday I was in charge of the bus going to Fort Leavenworth. There was about 20 young men being drafted, and we left for Fort Leavenworth.
Yeah, and your father and mother still lived there till their death in Junction City?
Yes, they did. They lived at 116 East Pine Street and 503 South Washington. We later moved over to that.
Wow.
It's right on the corner there.
Do you have brothers and sisters?
I had 2 brothers. Walter we moved to town in 1929. He died of a bursted appendix. My sister, she just died in about 4 or 5 years ago. My brother was a World War II veteran and was in the Italy and came up through the Brenner Pass and down through into Germany and Innsbruck, Austria, in a tank battalion, the 781st Tank Battalion. And he died here in 1978.
Huh.
So I'm the last of the Stueves.
Yeah.
That's here and around in my relation. There's a lot of Stueves in the area, but as far as I know right now, there are no direct relatives.
Do you remember December 7th, 1941?
Yes, I do. I was at 116 East Pine Street, and was helping my brother work on a radio in his car. And we had the radio on, and the announcer said a break for emergency communications, and he said that Pearl Harbor had just been bombed, and this was about 11:15 in the morning that I recall. That our time.
Yeah.
And so I was a young kid and didn't think too much about it, but I realized later that we were going to war.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, now tell us about your military experience, where you were inducted in, and then where you went for basic, and just give me the story of your career.
Okay. After getting into Fort Leavenworth, being I wasn't sworn into the Army yet. They took us out on details to sandbag the Missouri River, and we were there several days. And they said we were in the inactive reserves, and this lives for years and years. We had about 14 days inactive reserves, or active reserves, I should say. And then we got our uniforms, our khakis, and our boots, and our orders. We had those, and there was another fellow from Kansas City, and I opened my order, and it said report to Fort Riley, Kansas. So we both went to Kansas City, and we went out to his folks' home, very, very wealthy family, and we stayed there for a short period of time, and then got back on the train and headed for Fort Riley. I was met at the Fort Riley depot with a 6x6, and there were just a few of us that got on the 6x6, and they moved us over to Forsyth, Camp Forsyth, or CRTC, or Republican Flats, whatever you want to call it, and went through processing there, and I was down into Troop K of the Mechanized Cavalry at that time, Troop K, and it's down by the dike. It's the buildings and everything are gone now, and there's no resemblance of where we were at, but to this day. But we took training there 13 weeks plus, and while we were there, Joe Louis was taking training also, the famous world champion boxer, and he used to play golf over on the golf courses there. But anyway, I was a squad leader there, about 12 young guys, and very intelligent. We had the most intelligent group that I saw in the Army. They were out of the universities, and you could tell them one time and they could respond, and we always took the top prizes in our squad leaders and so forth. And then I finished training, and I thought, well, I'd like to get in the Air Corps. So I applied for the Air Cadets, and I had to have a birth certificate. So I wrote to Topeka to get a birth certificate, and it came back, and all my papers that I'd filled out in the Army said Freddie C., and that birth certificate said Fred C. And I said, oh, golly, have I stirred up a mess. So to this day, if I'm write anything for the government, to do anything with the government, its name is Freddie C. has to be there, because I applied for a reprint of all my medals and everything, and had it all printed out, Freddie, and then I signed it Fred C., and boy, it came back in a flash. I didn't think the government could act that fast, but anyway, it did come back, and then I realized what I did, and I did the paperwork over and signed it Freddie C., and then I got a reprint of all my medals, and so I was happy about that. And well, they discontinued the Air Cadets. I got to the door, and that's about all. And they were closing up the ASTP program also. The young men that went into colleges, and they were closing it out, and they were sending those back for training, and we got a lot of them in our training, and that's why we had such a intelligent group. And after training, then I went to school in Fort Riley. They had a good program for tanks. I went for light tanks, the M5s. They had Continental engines, and then some of them had the twin Cadillac engines in them, which were very fantastic in operation, and the mechanism that operated and transmission and everything. And I told myself, when I got through school, that's the kind of car I want when I get out of the service, is a car with an automatic transmission. And I did that. When I got out of the service, I had to sign a sheet of paper, and it took me several months to get a car. You don't go down and buy them in those days. You had to put your name on the list. Anyway, from there I went to, graduated out of the schools at Fort Riley and was transferred over to the 29th Calvary, which is Camp Whitside. And our program there was to do problems with the OCS. Fort Riley had a well-constructed OCS program that turned out a lot of officers before the war and during the war there. And so we did problems with them with the tanks and the vehicles and so forth. Well, then they said, well, they was closing down, and they shipped us up on top of to Camp Whitside Hill. The water towers are still there today, and we pitched all our pup tents up there. All the guys were going to be shipped out, and it just the Camp Whitside was just vacant with troops. But why they shipped us up there, and then we had to wait for our troop train, I don't know what the conflict was. But anyway, we was up there at least 2.5 weeks, living in pup tents, and it seemed like it rained every day. And you had your barracks bag and your clothes and tried to keep things warm, keep them dry on a hill, and when it raining every day, it was just about impossible. But anyway, we lived through that, and finally our troop train came in and was right by the old territory capital, which side our barracks were right across the highway from the first Kansas temporary capital. And we got on our troop train and headed for Camp Campbell, Kentucky. And that's where I joined the 20th Armored Division for the 412th Armored Field Artillery, and started a new program there. I was in battalion maintenance with service battery, and still operating with my MOS with the tanks. And they had the Sherman M4 tanks, the M7 tanks artillery, which an M7 is a artillery piece built on a chassis of an M4 tank. And we had to take care of the half tracks and the peeps and the jeeps and the 6x6s, and that was my duty to do that. And I loved the job. Later on, I was a battalion dispatcher, and that was interesting, to dispatch all those vehicles when they were sent out to Clarksville or Nashville or Hopkinsville, Kentucky, there to get other supplies or anything like that. Well, it was a very interesting job. But mainly it was to stay with the tanks and pull maintenance on them. So then we went through the Tennessee maneuvers, and this was something new to me, to get down into the forest, and it seemed like it rained there in Tennessee maneuvers, where you had to take care of your body and all your equipment and everything, and the mud and the discomforts and everything. But leave it to a GI. They know how to take care of, and if you don't, why, you're not going to last too long in the Army. But The officers and the enlisted personnel, we worked together and worked this deal out in the Tennessee maneuvers and learned a lot of things, and we did quite well on the point system, and the generals never, the elite people that came around to inspect and everything, we did very well in the maneuvers. So then it came time to send us overseas, and we had to get all our equipment, dip it in cosmoline, and so it wouldn't rust on the ships, and take care of all the spare parts and get them all lined up and get them on the trains and ship them towards the port of embarkation. We did that, and then we shipped out and went to Boston, Camp Miles Standish, in Boston, Massachusetts. We were there we landed there, and about a foot of snow on the ground and colder than the heck, and we was in tar paper shacks, no insulation, and pot-belly stoves on each end of the barracks we were in, and try to keep warm. And it was we used about everything we could to keep warm in that climate.
What month and year was that?
That was in January
Of what year?
44.
44.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And then we got the orders to get on the ship. They took us by a bus down to the ship to get on it and sail out of Boston Harbor, and that was quite an experience to climb on a boat, or ship, I should say, and we were like sardines in a can. We were 3 bunks, and this was a converted luxury liner, USS Brazil, and they'd converted it to transport personnel from the United States to the European conflicts. And they about 4 or 5 days out, I had a picture, he's going to explode it, but of our ship, and every day while the Navy on board would use their guns, and they'd fire up in the air, and then everyone would try to shoot through the circle of the smoke and all that, you know. And we thought that was practice, you know, and we got along with that all okay. We was always up on deck, and you had to have your Mae West with you, your floating device. I didn't think much about it, but it was going to save your life. But we had to have that with us all the time. And so this went on, and one day there was some commotion on the back, and I noticed they were rolling these 55-gallon barrels off the back of the ship there, and pretty soon the water would explode and go several hundred feet in the air, and I thought, wait a minute, I don't think this is practice. And so about a day later at Chowline, where the scuttlebutt came down, that the Germans had U-boats on our tail, and this is the way we got rid of them. Well, I don't know if we hit any of them or damaged any of them, but after a day or so, we were relieved and kept on sailing towards Europe. Then we landed in Le Havre, France, in the first part of February there, and went into we stayed out in the harbor because there were so many damaged ships and debris in the water that they just put us in just so easy that didn't want to run into any of that underground stuff, and it was damaged there, and to damage our ship. We unloaded on a prefabricated dock, big tanks welded together away from the shoreline, and went into on ground there, and they had big 6x6 cattle trucks loaded us up, and they packed us in there, and again, like sardines in a can. Couldn't got another GI on, and well, we had a group that went ahead of us, got our where we was going to be stationed and so forth there, and so we knew where we was going with the Charleville, France, and they took us with a big 6x6s and scattered us out to each one of our units and so forth. this was a chateau in France, and it was quite unique, but to heat it and it was kind of a job to do that. But with all our blankets and everything, be out of the air and everything, we survived. And while we was there, we drew our equipment from Rouen, France. It came in on another shipment, and we drove our tanks from Rouen back to our little chateau. And then we got orders. We had to put duck bills on our tracks. And a duck bill is about 4 or 5 inches wider, and you had to take the tracks apart and put the duck bills on, so it made the track, it was about 16 inches wide and make it about 20 inches wide, so whenever you went across any earth that was saturated with water or anything like that, well, we had good flotation for the tanks, and they call them peat bogs in southern Germany. And the story that goes with that, we had one tank that got off the highway and got into a peat bog. And it just about impossible to get a tank out, because we had 2 tank recovery units, 2 wreckers, and some other vehicles to pull that 30-ton plus vehicle out of a peat bog, and every time you moved it, it wanted to sink down in the ground or into the peat bog and just pulling dead weight. We broke cables about 1 inch thick. It sounded like a artillery piece going off, and dangerous.
Yeah.
And we pulled this, finally got it out. It was a headquarters tank, and it took a lot of time to do that. But I just recently, to go with this story, at our reunion in Colorado Springs here just a few weeks ago, I was talking to our former president of the 20th Armored Division, and we was kind of chatting around about southern Germany and about the peat bogs, and he said, yeah, he says, I had a tank that went into one of those. And I said, what? I said, his name was Adolf Walters. I said, Adolf, is that your tank we tried to pull out down in the peat bogs? And he said, it sure was. He says, I was there. I said, wait a minute. And so we were so close together there was overlapping there with information, and we had quite a chat about that tank. It was one of his tanks that we pulled out of there. That was quite a extraordinary job to do that, to save that tank, but it was almost lost. But they were warned about this, when you get off the highway, to be careful or off any solid ground. But anyway, we got our equipment and started up through France. And the amount of tanks the United States lost through France and up to the German border there, it was tremendous. Every place you saw, tanks were burned or shot out or just ahead of us, you know. And so we got into Holland, and the Holland people greeted us. They had, they came out. It was about time for apples, I guess, because they came out with a basket full of apples, and we'd stop a little ways. They'd climb up on our tank and pour a bushel of apples down into our tank. We had apples there for many days. That just find them around there and eat them. It was wonderful. And you see at the front of the doors of the houses there, they always had their wooden shoes out in front. It was very, very unique, and I'll always remember that. And they were very friendly, but they needed help, and so we passed it. Go ahead.
What month was this then? You
It was
came
in
in about February, and this was about when?
This is February and going into March. Mm-hmm.
So the apples were that time?
Evidently, they had them in storage or something. A lot of, that's like finding the wine and the Calvados and all that stuff. They hid that stuff from the Germans.
Yeah.
And they had it there. But that's when they'd bring it out. And we'd stop and and they'd bring this out to our tanks. And you see the people, the Holland people there, come out and sweeping the streets and the sidewalks with a homemade brush, you know, and kept that clean. They were clean people. Well, anyway, we went through Holland and into. We entered into. First city was Aachen, Germany. And never forget this city, because the signs. In my 20th Armored, they took a picture of the entrance. We went in, and it says, "Now you're entering the German, and no fraternization." And so you couldn't talk with the Germans and so forth. But in the Aachen, Germany, it was pretty well hit by artillery and a lot of fighting there. And when we were there was still some fighting. And we billeted in a large barn. It was 2-story, and that was large as the training building at Kansas State over here, where they train in football in bad weather. That building over there, I think Brandenburg building. But anyway, it was that large, and I think they had animals on the first floor and hay in the second. We went up on the second floor, and it's full of hay, and boy, we were going to good night's sleep, you know. So we had all our guard posted, you know. We always took turns of our tank and had guard around it all the time. And then we all went up in the hayloft and went to sleep, and we'd wake up the next guy to take guard, you know. And towards morning there, we woke up, and golly, the guy said, "Hey, looky, the Germans are running out the far end of the barn there." And I said, "Golly, sleeping with them." And but they never bothered us, and I think the lower end, the guys down there where they do fire on them, but I don't recall any casualties at that time. But it was that's what happened a lot of times. You're sleeping right with your enemy. And so to add to this, in 1988, I took the wife over there, and my daughter's husband was in NATO. He was an officer in NATO and had time off, and so I sent some maps that I had over that we could look at when we had time. And we went down some of the same roads that during the war. And I said, "Let's go into Aachen. I want to look at this, find this big barn." And we drove all over Aachen, and I never did find this barn. And I don't know why. I don't think they ever tore it down, but this was, you know, a good number of years afterwards. And why they'd tear that barn down, I don't know, but we never found it. We found a lot of other cities that we'd artilleried and shot down, but they'd take every brick and put it back in place. You could tell it never hit by an enemy fire or anything like that. But Germans were very unique about rebuilding buildings and so forth. But I had a good time there, and showing the wife where we'd been, and we went clear on down to Austria. But during our travel through Aachen and on over to the Rhine River, that's where we had a lot of problems there at Dusseldorf, is the tail end of the Battle of the Bulge. And we had artillery out, and the Germans had artillery too, and we were shooting across the river, and they were shooting down on us because they were up on the hill. We were out maintaining one of our M7s that had some problems with the engine on it. We were out on a plateau, and the Germans would roll this big cannon artillery piece out of the hill. It was dug in, rolled it out on railroad tracks, and fired directly at us. And they started shooting at us. I said, "Gee, guys, just fold up and get out of here." But they never never a frac, we were in our tanks and it was bouncing around, but we never got hurt by it. But we got out of there soon and left that M7 there to another day to go back and then we had another tank knocked out down on the Rhine River, and we went down to that, and I took the radios out of it and brought it back, the receiver, and our compartments above the tracks there had a spare parts kit, and I could take the receiver out and plug it right in, and I tuned it to BBC in London. We had BBC in London. When that tank was moving, we were tuned to BBC in London all during the war. And we heard everything that came through BBC of the death of Roosevelt and anything, Axis Sal and all that stuff. We had it first in my tank. It was quite unique, but I was assistant driver and radio operator at that time. And so we went on down the Rhine River, and just out of Bonn, Germany, they had the Hodges pontoon bridge, and we crossed the Rhine River at that point on a pontoon bridge, and that was something, because we went down a couple times to cross it, and the Germans were trying to blow this pontoon bridge out. They'd float demolition down the river and it'd blow, So we put searchlights on that. Put guards out there with the guns to see these floating ammunition, and they'd blow it up before it hit the barges. And then later on, we strung cables up in the air with balloons. So they was dive bombing in, and we took a lot of airplanes out to protect that bridge. It was one of the main crossings right there. But anyway, we went down one morning at it was before daybreak, and they said everything was okay, and so we started to cross the pontoon bridge and got on the other side, and it was kind of a steep hill, and that's where the Germans were waiting for us. And we had quite a battle on the other side, but we fought through that, and it was on the east side of the Rhine River. And what the stories were that Hitler thought that the Rhine River would be his fortress to save Germany. If he keep the enemy on the other side, that he could whip us in due manner. But the Americans got on the east side and pursued on south and to different cities. We went down through Cologne and Frankfurt and along the Rhine River, and then we got down into southern Germany. We went in through Hadamar and Hanau and Frankfurt and ended up down near Dachau. We were one of the first outfits in Dachau, and I remember that very, very plain. We didn't realize what was there until we saw this train around this compound, and we had a battle with the guards. They had built up a wall, and up on top of that was a area for the guards to stand up and with machine guns, and all along this wall around it, well, it was every so many yards, why there was a guard situation on that with all electric barbed wire and to keep anybody in and keep everybody out, Well, we had battles with those guards, and we some of them we had to use artillery pieces on and horizontal, and we wiped that out, and then we went in the gates, and I remember the train carloads all around, and there was about 40 carloads of prisoners in those enclosed trail cars. We opened up the doors. They were all locked from the outside, and opened them up, and the stench and the Germans There's Jews, there's Greeks, there's all nations of personnel in there. There was 99 point so was dead, and some of them are still alive, waiting to be taken down to the crematories and being burned. But there's a few of them crawled out and got out of the car, and some of them just died right there. And one of my friends said he offered a little chocolate to one of them, and he said that was the wrong thing to do, because those people just couldn't stand any food at that time, and it wasn't long he was dead also. And they said, well, don't give them anything. So we called the medics in and tried to relieve some of them, try to help them. But they were so far gone, they were just skin and bones. And there were 40 carloads of those, and they had, I think they had five crematory inlets down at the building, and they'd take them down there and dump them, and they had little conveyors. They'd lay them on a deal and take them in there and shove them into crematories and burn them up. We were there for a short time, but when we went in the gates, I saw all these lined up like Johnny on the spot toilets, you see around on construction, all lined up there, and I thought, what the heck's that stuff? And we opened up a door on one of them, and here was they'd get the guys or the people in there that were still living, and they'd turn on the gas and gas them right there. They'd fall out and then put them on a conveyor deal and take them down and burn them up. But that was hard to stomach to see those people in that condition, and to do the problems with human beings like that. There was all walks of life, and they just you just couldn't believe that they were treating people that way. We had our mission. We was headed for Munich, and Munich's about, I'm gonna guess, 15, 20. Dachau was just a stone's throw out of this compound, and we tried to talk to some of the people there, and we thought it was just a work compound where they're doing a lot of work, and they would never admit they was having all kinds of things going on there. But anyway, to go back to this story, in 1988 I took the wife into Dachau and told her just what I saw and what they have today. They'd cleaned it all up, and there's one barracks there that was the original barracks, still on the foundation. The crematories were all down at the far end, and we went down and walked through those, and they had a chapel that the German people had built, I guess, or the memorial people. And then at the entrance to the gate, they had a big museum there of things that they confiscated throughout Germany, and there was 600 of these camps in Europe, 600 of them. You name them, there was all kinds, all shapes, and all sizes of them. The one at Hadamar and at Hanau, one was Hadamar was an insane asylum, and they took the bodies and skinned them and made lampshades out of them, of the human bodies. You can believe that or not, but that's what they did. And it was terrible, because there was still some of those around. And a lot of those insane asylums, that people would come out and they're striped, and we didn't know what to do with them. They were running, and we called for help with the medics, and because we had our orders what to do, and we didn't know what to do with those people. But anyway, we left Dachau there, and well, the wife, and to talk about that a minute, we went through that and saw all the pictures and stuff they had in there, and they kind of downplayed it to a certain extent. And later on, our division has a 20th Armored Division bronze plaque there at Dachau. It was dedicated with the German people and so forth. If you go there today, you'll see our 20th Armored Division insignia and the plaque there. But that was one of the worst, the tragedies of the war, to see people in that condition. We also saw the trenches, where you saw in a lot of movies today, where they lined up the people on the big high trenches, and they'd shoot them and they'd fall over into these trenches. I was out to those too, and they actually happened, and the sides of them. But some people lived out of that. But usually the Germans would go back through the trenches, and anybody wiggled or thought was not, they'd shoot them again down in the trenches. But there's people that can live and tell about those, that crawled out of those and lived to tell their story. Well, we went out of Dachau back to the war story and headed for Munich. And this was to set the stage on it, that this was SS Academy, where the German Army had the elite SS troopers, like Army Academy in West Point and so forth. They trained them with different types of artillery and different guns that they had. And this was about a 6-story building, walls around it, and we had information that there was at least 1,500 in this compound. And so we sent scouts out around and just scouted out, and we brought in the artillery. We fought with other units. We had the 42nd infantry outfit there, and fought with our artillery, and they'd wait for the artillery to clear away with them, and then the infantry would go in, and we shelled that building for days, and it was built with reinforced concrete, and I have pictures of the holes we shot through that building, and they had tunnels underneath that. Only got so bad that they'd go to the tunnels, and those were hundreds of yards out away from the building, and try to escape that way. But I think, after all, we killed about 700 there, and then the end of it, the end of his story with that, there was a doctor rode down the street and came up and on a bicycle, and he says, "There's another gun emplacement at so and so," and he said, "I'll lead you to him if you'll follow me." And we thought, well, oh, that's just a mistake, you know. But some of the outfit followed him, and sure enough, there was another gun emplacement we took out, and that ended the campaign there with the Academy of the SS troopers.
What time frame was this now, Fred?
This was in April, the first part of May. We was at Dachau at April 29th.
In what year?
In 45.
Okay.
And into Munich, about 3-4 days later, was it probably May 1st.
Just before
Second.
the war was
Yeah.
declared over.
But we had a lot of fighting yet to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, from Munich, well, we went east, and what was happening, the Germans were retreating, and every bridge they were coming to, they had it all ready for dynamite, and we had to be there first to clear those bridges, or they'd dynamite them out, and then we had to find another place to go. Well, we'd find some of them, and I saw a lot of the overpasses off of the Autobahn with big old shells about so big laying on the I-beams, you know, that they didn't explode. Thank God that we went underneath some of those. But that's what we run into, and because they were evacuating very, very fast, you know. And we were capturing hundreds, divisions at a time, and what to do with them. They had their white flags, you know, and all that stuff. But talking about white flags, that isn't a sure bet that everybody's clear in the city. Because we had one city we was approaching, and we'd shelled it, and they put out their white flags, you know, and we got up close there, and we was going to go in and take over the city, and Colonel Jones with his tank around the corner, and he was up in his turret there, and the machine rattled and killed him right there. And so we backed off, and said, well, we called in the artillery, and with our ammunition we could put it on fire and everything else, you know, and horizontal, and we mowed the town down and burned it to the ground. Everybody, that you just couldn't take any prisoners there. Several times we had problems like that with the SS moving, and they'd think, well, we'll put white flags out and we'll get a lot of these Americans.
So Colonel Jones was killed in Munich then? Or was it after you left Munich?
It was right after Munich there. Mm-hmm. Yeah. His picture is not in our book, but we got an insert for that picture for him.
You were headed south?
South and east.
Towards Salzburg?
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah. And there's so many of those little bridges that sometimes we had to go around them. Sometimes we had to call in engineers to build the pontoons to go across them because they're just too deep to go with tanks or vehicles. We went on east and through the forest, and that's where a lot of POWs came out, and went over around Sion, Germany. We captured about 200 there, and if I may, I might tell about a story there that we captured about, I'm guessing 200, you know, and we put them in a cemetery there in Sion, Germany, and then at night we'd take them and put them over in a big barn and keep them in kind of in a hayloft and so forth there, and then bring them out, and then we tried to ask the German people to help us feed them because we were so far ahead of our lines for gas and food that we were running low on food ourselves. But they came out and they'd furnish some food for them. Well, that's years later. My daughter sent me, after the war and everything, my daughter sent me a clip out of the Christian Science Monitor paper about this German that was captured by the Americans at so-and-so at Sion, Germany, see? Yeah. And I told the wife, I said, we captured this German. And I said, I'm going to find him. So we worked on computer then at that time, online and everything, but about a year later, I said, let's try to find him in Germany on telephone. And he wasn't in Germany anymore. So I said, the last resort, let's try USA. And here his name came up. Claus W. Sellier in Escondido, California. And I called him by telephone. And I said, are you the German that wrote the article for the Christian Science Monitor? He said, yes, sir. He said, how did you find me? I said, wait a minute here. I didn't know what I was going to get into, you know. So we talked. And he consented, yes, that's where he's at, you know. And he told me about the cemetery, how the Americans took care of him there and took him over to the barn, and so that started kind of a elated story to be told. Well, this goes back when we talked about wartime, where he was at and all that. And he'd send me a chapter. He said, "Fred, read this and edit it and put it in good language, you know." And then I'd get another chapter and another chapter. I sent it back to him. Pretty soon I realized he was writing a book. And he wanted me to edit this book all for him. And, well, after about a year, he said, "Fred, why don't you write the foreword to this book?" And the publishing company out of Oregon said, "Yes, why don't you do that? Why don't you edit all this stuff for us?" Because they had editors and they wanted us to do it. So anyway, that's what we did. We edited the book, and then he wanted me to write the foreword to the book. And I told the wife, I said, "I never have done anything like that." So I got out a lot of government papers that I had and looked at forwards to books and articles, and I said, "Well, I'll tell it like it is." And so I wrote a foreword to it and sent it to the publishing company, and boy, they said, "We'll print it." So then later on, then they sent me the whole book together and wanted me to edit it, kind of fine edit, you know, and I'd send it back to him, and then he gave the okay to publish it, so they published it out in Oregon there. And so
did you wind up in Salzburg then eventually?
Yeah, so on east there, we went from Sion to Pauling, Germany, and from Pauling we had orders to go down to Freilassing, Germany.
Yes. And
to pull a locomotive off the railroad tracks there. So all the bridges were being bombed out, or and the troops couldn't get across the Salz River there. And so we went down and we spent, I think, 2 days there trying to figure out how we could get that locomotive off, and we wrapped our big cables around the tank recovery units and backed off and pulled that sucker over in the water. And then they could go with the VX, go bump, 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 bump on the ties across the bridge into Salzburg, Austria. And some of the tanks that went across the Salz River at that point there,
yeah.
I've got a picture in the book on that, and it was about 3 foot deep in there. Good gravel, so they could do okay, but the other vehicles couldn't do it. So anyway, we got across the Salz River and went into Salzburg, Austria, and so when the war ended there, and that's where we got. You want to see some pictures here of we captured.
Yes, show that.
We found Göring's vehicle. It's armored, and we also had Hitler's vehicle, and we had to swap engines in them to make one run. And we made Göring's run, and we brought it back to the United States on a ship. And it was here in the museums in the United States, and later it was taken to Canada. And to this day, it's in a Canada museum. It's Göring's custom-made vehicle that he rode around in. And that's it.
Yeah.
Now, and there's stories about that. I've got 2 stories that's written for our division dispatch about finding Göring's automobile, and then we got it and we did repairs on it. And also, if I had all the gold and the pictures that were taken out of the salt mines in Salzburg, Austria, we'd have billions and billions of dollars. It's amazing what they stored, and the people later had to collect their belongings and the pictures that were taken out of their castles and their homes and everything else. But it's one of the salt mines are well preserved pictures and that stuff. And
So it was announced to you that the war was over in May 8th, I think it was.
May 7th.
May 7th.
But see that the war, yeah, they said the war was over May 7th, but we were still in combat.
Uh-huh.
And that generals, I can't read their name, they're on my map, that came up to us in Salzburg, Austria, and gave up their command. A German representative was Kesselring. Kesselring.
Really?
Uh-huh. He turned over to the 7th Army. That's who it was. Garner Brau, B-R-A-U. He was a major, and then the representative of the Kesselring Armistice Commission. They were all turned over to the 7th Army at Salzburg, Austria, that ended the war. But still there was a lot of fighting there, and we pulled back to Pauling, Germany, and was kind of pulling maintenance on our tanks and stuff, and about a matter of hours, they said, rearm and get ready to go to Yugoslavia. The Tito wasn't giving up down there, and so we sent the 33rd Calvary ahead to scout out and see what the problem was down there, that he wasn't giving up in the mountains. And they got to the outskirts of the city there where Tito was located, and they went in and they had a skirmish there and pulled back in the mountains, and then finally Tito came out and gave up, and I think that practically ended the war there, and it'd be May 8th, 1945.
When did you get notice that you were going to come home then?
It was in July.
Uh-huh.
We came home. I got on the boat in my birthday.
July 29th.
And well, we sailed. Came out of Salzburg, Austria, by train to Camp Lucky Strike, and from there we was 6x6 over to the boat. Came home on the USS Heritage, another converted luxury liner. Yeah. You know, a lot of them came home in different boats, but I'm speaking about my particular boat,
and
ship.
Were you discharged in where?
Well, we sent to California, and we were still fighting Japan.
Yeah.
And we went out to Camp Cook, California, and our training was to train on the beaches out there. And our orders was to, when we went into the beaches of Japan, was to kill everybody on the beach. Everybody on that beach. Because all the Japanese kids were going to have poison arrows and going to run up and jab the GIs, you know. And I've got all that information here that's declassified now. And I didn't think we had that many divisions we could throw at the Japanese. But anyway, that's what our mission was, to kill everybody on the beach. It sounds bad, but it's the way the war is. And then they dropped the A-bombs, and that took care of the Japanese. It brought them to their knees.
Yeah, so you were at Camp Cook when you got notice that you were going to be discharged, or where?
Well, I was at Camp Cook, and we was on the point system. And we had a lot of points to get out, and we couldn't get out of the service. And we went down and marched on the general headquarters, the whole division, believe it or not. And just a few days later, they said, get these troops moving out. So I was shipped back to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, and got discharged out of Fort Leavenworth, Kansas.
Yeah.
In
When did you get married, Freddie?
Well, when I left for the service, and came back, why, there's all the girlfriends that were married or gone. But I found a beautiful young gal there, and she's younger than I am. But we had good vibes, and we got married in May 11th, 1950.
Where did you meet then?
We met in Junction City. She worked for a accounting office, and she did books where I did part-time work after the service at Bob Mead's battery and service for electrical works and magnetos and stuff like that, and generators. And that's where we met there.
How many children did you have?
I have 4 daughters.
Ah.
Yeah, they're scattered out the United States. There's 2 of them back in Washington, D.C., 1 in Oregon, and 1 lives south of where we live, the youngest one.
Well.
And she's a nurse in the hospital.
Now, what was your occupation then after the war was over now, and did you use the GI Bill and go back to school?
Yeah, I went to K-State, and after that I went to, heard of a job opening at Abilene, Kansas, with Kansas Power and Light. And I worked there over 30 years plus. And then they was building Jeffrey Energy Center up near St. Mary's, and I was transferred up there as an electrical supervisor and supervising all electrical work up there. And that was a big change to go from relays to PC boards, and I went to school back east. Every time I had a new deal to take care of, I went to school on it.
Did you graduate from K-State, or?
No, I didn't graduate, but I did well over there, and jobs were hard to find, and from there on I had two positions with Kansas Power and Light, and I worked 40 years for them.